Okay. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the 2021 iteration of the Hispanic Latinx Research and Creativity Symposium. I apologize for my backdrop here. For some reason, Zoom is only letting me on through the web, but at least it's letting me on. So no fancy pictures, just my bedroom furniture in the background. So I guess that's just part of where we are with this pandemic at this moment. My name is Kent Wilkinson. I'm director of the Thomas J. Harris Institute for Hispanic and International Communication in the College of Media and Communication here at Texas Tech. We're very pleased that you've joined us today. The Harris Institute launched this symposium 6 years ago in anticipation of Texas Tech attaining Hispanic serving institution status, for which we qualified in the fall semester of 2017 and received the official designation 2 years ago. So our original and continuing intent was to convene faculty, staff, and advanced students doing work on Hispanic Latinx topics and populations so that we could be more familiar with each other's work and see some of the possibilities to connect our work and collaborate. And this remains a central goal of the symposium and indeed the broader mission of the Institute. But in the past couple of years, we've been emphasizing how Texas Tech can better fulfill its mission and its responsibilities as a Hispanic serving institution. So two of today's sessions are particularly relevant to this objective: our keynote address and discussion by Dean Jesse Perez Mendez and Lucy Arellano of the College of Education will be focusing on the best practices of successful Hispanic serving institutions. And that's going to be begin at 12:30. There will be a presentation for maybe 40 minutes and then a discussion. And that discussion is very important because we do want to get people's ideas about the sorts of shifts that Texas Tech can make, sort of identifying what we're doing well, what we need to improve on, and the shifts we can make in order to be really fulfill that obligation as an HSI. And then also immediately following that at 2 o'clock, there will be a discussion of a project underway to create a Latin American and Iberian studies program, including a Center for the Study of the Hispanic World here at Texas Tech. I understand that name is sort of up for negotiation, but the people who are leading that initiative really want to take this opportunity to get some ideas from the Texas Tech community about how what the center might look like, what the program might focus on. And so again, your input is going to be very important to that. So again, that's at 2 o'clock. So we strongly encourage your input during sessions, those two sessions. We also have 2 research and creativity sessions, one that's going to immediately follow my opening remarks, and then another one to conclude the program at beginning at 3:30. And also we have an important discussion, I think, particularly to where we are now and at the university and the news we're reading every day, and that is a discussion among some graduate students about how international and domestic Hispanic and Latinx students have coped with the academic and personal effects of the pandemic. That's at 11. I wanted to make a quick note that we are recording today's sessions, and we will be throughout the day, so that people who have schedule conflicts will be able to watch them and listen to them later. And also we want to have a record of the discussions, because we do plan on summarizing some of the key points and then sharing that probably with the Division of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, and also the upper administration, just in terms of, this is the kind of discussion that's happening at this point related to HSI status. So we do like to see everybody by camera, if possible live, but we also understand that some people may prefer not to be recorded. That's fine. You can raise questions live by hailing the moderator, either through an icon or waving your hand or jumping up and down or whatever that might be. But you can also use the chat function if you prefer to raise questions and make comments. So let me emphasize that we are very pleased you've joined us at this challenging time. Seems like we've been saying that for too long now, but it's sort of the reality that we are dealing with. And we know that your time is very precious at this time as we wrap up the semester. And also, I think a lot of us are fighting sort of the Zoom burnout syndrome at this point after having so many of these meetings virtually. So thank you for powering through that, dedicating some of your time. And we really look forward to resuming face-to-face meetings in the next year. And lest we forget, happy Earth Day, everybody. It's since we're kind of, inside and behind closed doors, it's hard to remember that, but today's Earth Day and extremely important. I hope you are following some of the news regarding efforts to sort of bring the global community back to the table in terms of discussing the importance of slowing climate change. So I'm now going to turn it over to Gabriel Domínguez, Partida, the Assistant Director of the Harris Institute, in order to get our first panel underway. Gabriel.
Thank you so much, Dr. Wilkinson, for this introduction, and welcome to everyone to this first panel of the 6th Hispanic and Latinx Research and Creativity Symposium, Contemporary Perspectives on Hispanic and Latinx Communities. As Dr. Wilkinson said, my name is Gabriel Domínguez Partida, and I am the Assistant Director of the Thomas J. Harris Institute for Hispanic and International Communication. And before introducing each one of the participants and explains the panel logistics, I really want to take this opportunity to thank Dr. Wilkinson for his efforts to make or to put together this wonderful event each year. So I think it is really relevant for our institution, and I think that you will find the conversations that we had today very relevant for the field. Well, this panel presents 4 research projects from different fields such as sociology, higher education, agricultural and applied economics, as well as art history. We are going to follow the order established in the program. I've made a slight change as requested by one of the presenters that will join to the session later. And I will introduce each panelist, and each one of them will have 12 minutes, a strict 12 minutes, so we can have chance to have this opportunity to exchange questions from the audience. But please feel free to jump in on the chat and ask your questions in the meantime, and I will read them at the end of the session. Or if you have or you want to hold that specific question until the end of the session, just raise your hand in the end, and I will give you the mic in this moment and at that moment. So we are going to start first with Jesús Ayala Candia. He's a native from El Paso, Texas, and attended Sam Houston State University, where he earned a Bachelor of Science in Criminal Justice and Criminology, with a concentration in sociology. He is currently a second-year master's student in the Department of Sociology at Texas State University. His research interests are international migration, border enforcement, and social-legal interactions. He presents the study, the Weberian Frontier, revisiting border enforcement through a bureaucratic lens. Jesus, the virtual floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Let me share my screen. Okay, hope everybody can see the slides. All right. So once again, thank you so much for having me. My name is Jesús Ayala. The title of my presentation is called The Weberian Frontier, Revisiting Operation Blockade Through a Bureaucratic Lens. Being from the borderland is truly unique. We are tied to 2 great nations by ethnicity, culture, history, and sometimes even more so by our territorial disputes, as they too are as big as Texas and are as unforgiving as a Chihuahuan desert. Drawing from Max Weber's authority legitimization, I discussed how during his tenure at the El Paso sector, Chief Sylvester Reyes redefined the bureaucratic authority context of Border Patrol, highlighting that again, it was the Hispanic, not an Anglo, who managed to make border control a reality. So let's break the theory down. Baver argued that social actors obey authority when it's deemed to be legitimately founded on one or more of the three pure types of domination, which are rational, traditional, and charismatic. In the rational authority sense, it's authority that's rooted in the collective agreement of laws or of the judicial system. In the traditional, this is authority that says to have a valid of your aspect, meaning a long-standing arrangement, values, culture, norms that have been accepted as established norms in society. And lastly, the charismatic, which is authority that is based on the superhuman characteristic or quality of the leader of a group, so long as those characteristics or those qualities are in the scope of the group's goals. And as we shall see, Chief Reyes basically was the embodiment of that charismatic authority here at the border. Turning to our case study, before looking at our Weberian bureaucrat, we have to understand the situation that ushered Chief Reyes in. Border Patrol's abusive behavior is well documented in immigration literature, though it has been scaled back in recent years. That wasn't the case in 1990s El Paso. Bowie High School, depicted here in this picture, is about 50 yards away from the Rio Grande, right across from Juarez. Most of the students come from immigrant families, live in mixed status households, are DACA students, or till this day cross daily the border between El Paso and Juarez to go to school. But for about 50 years beforehand, Border Patrol verbally and physically abused and assaulted students, faculty, staff, and the community of El Paso at large in order to ascertain their documentation information or to gather information of potential undocumented migrants living inside of El Paso. This, I argue, is essentially Border Patrol using its traditional, not the rational. The rational here is already implied, but it's a traditional because of this quote that I have at the bottom from one of the Bowie High School students who said that this is the way that's here at the border, and we just have to accept it. In other words, they accepted the abuse because it had been established for so long, they just thought it was natural. Nobody questioned it. To summarize, Bowie High School sued Border Patrol in 1983 in a civil lawsuit against the harassment, and the judge ordered CBP to be removed from the grounds, but ruled that they could still patrol the river because at the end of the day, it's still federal land. Baver asserts that in traditionalist periods, such as in this case with Bowie High School, charisma is the great revolutionary force, and Chief Reyes was that force itself. As you can see, he was basically getting his charisma from his own race and from his own personality. He was born in El Paso from a Mexican immigrant family, first Mexican-American to lead Border Patrol since 1984. He was the first Mexican-American appointed to oversee operations at the El Paso sector. In a nutshell, he was a 360 from his previous Anglo Border Patrol chiefs in the area. Moreover, he attended city town hall briefings in order to address concerns personally. He listened and acted upon the civil rights group's recommendations against his sector, and also maintained what he called an open door policy to his sector in the community. And as he's quoted right there at the bottom, he said that he found it hard for people to dislike you if they know you. If you can resolve problems by virtue of meeting, everybody wins. So we can quickly see how the people of El Paso basically felt enamored with Chief Reyes' charisma because it's something they had never experienced. In concert, Baver argues that the charismatic leader cares more about controlling the means of power to bolster his image, more so than just fame or money. Reyes, as we had seen, had basically won the trust of the community of El Paso, so he didn't delay in establishing border control. In September of 1983, he ordered 400 of his agents to be spaced out every 50 yards along the river bank to keep what he called a watchful glaze over the Rio Grande in order to deter undocumented crossings from Juarez. This would become known as Operation Blockade. By placing such a visual of CBP presence, undocumented crossings dropped to a 72% by the end of 1993, something that had never been seen. And as again, he's quoted right there, he said that he didn't care if they were arrested an undocumented alien, so long as they managed to do something that had never been done. And indeed, controlling the border was exactly what he wanted. Though there was some questions about the tactical usage of blockade at the time, 78% of the Hispanic population in El Paso approved Reyes' operation. Now, Baver contends that the charismatic leader must reassert his authority constantly. Otherwise, he or she risks appearing that his superhuman touch is gone or it's lost. In other words, he or she risks losing control of the situation. And Reyes knew this to be true. So in 1993, in December, largely breaking from his charismatic self, he proposed to build a wall along the border without consulting his superiors at the Immigration Naturalization Service, or much less the residents of El Paso. The outrage that ensued was mostly due to the upcoming political pressure of NAFTA that was rolling in 1994, and through many of the voices of the civil rights groups that supported Reyes. But though there was much back and forth, nothing ever really got done. And indeed, 78% of the population of El Paso supported the idea of building this wall. Now, the key difference between someone like Chief Reyes and former President Trump is that Chief Reyes didn't have to use his rational authority in this case to get his way. All he had to do was wait. And so, in April of 1995, some delinquents robbed a freight train crossing from Juarez to El Paso, and as some fire was exchanged between the parties, it basically solidified the reasoning why the wall was needed. And sure enough, the Mexican consulate is the one that struck the deal with the INS to build this 1.3-mile long fence, ironically enough, along the area that Chief Reyes had initially proposed. Because the INS had been impressed by the success of Operation Blockade to control the border, I argue that this overt display of force is in tandem with what Durkheim called his social current concept. This is when a social fact or a notion, an idea, gets enough traction that it must be repeated in order to establish or maintain order. The INS took advantage of this and replicated blockade, this time as its national operative named Operation Gatekeeper in the San Diego sector in California, causing an equal drop of undocumented entry. In post-9/11 America, we have seen this repeated to a larger scale every time, more notably through Operations Boot Heel and Jumpstart, which involved the usage of New Mexico Army reserves and the military at large, always to deter undocumented entry mixed in with some transnational threats. The biggest critique of all of these operations is that the longer that they're enforced, the more migrants that lost their lives as they tried to circumvent Border Patrol from entering. It's estimated that around 500 migrants per year lost their lives each year that Boot Heel and Jumpstart remain active. And just to drive this last point home, as this graph shows you, taken from data from the U.S. and Customs Border Protection, the undocumented entry never really recovered from the onset of Gatekeeper and Blockade 1993-1994. And as we threw more operations along the line, this pretty much plateaued. In fact, the spike you see over here at the bottom in 2019, that's from the most recent migrant search with the refugees and asylees trying to cross across the border. In closing, charismatic leaders like Chief Reyes have come and gone, but the effect they left behind continues to produce a chilling effect in the socio-historical context of border enforcement. As this paper has shown, the superhuman qualities of Chief Reyes enable him to single-handedly redefine how border enforcement is conducted by initiating the militarization of the border and the debate surrounding the border wall. But more importantly still is to recognize again that it was a Hispanic, not an Anglo, who managed to make border control become a reality. The borderland, once again, as beautiful as it may be, shows us that it's not just the cultural ties, but its feuding nature that makes us good neighbors. This is my selected list of references, which can be provided to you upon request. And that is my contact information in case I'm not able to cover any of your questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Jesus, for sharing this interesting overview of the border. Now it's time to go to the next presenter. And following our program, it's time to hear Dr. Lesley Wolff. She's an assistant professor in art history at Texas Tech University, specializing in Latinx and Latin American art and critical theory. Dr. Wolff's interdisciplinary research has appeared in journals such as Humanities, International Journal of Heritage Studies, African and Black Diaspora, and Food, Culture, and Society, among others. Dr. Wolff's current book manuscript, Hungry Eyes, Picturing Food Waste and Indigeneity in Post-Revolutionary Mexico City, is currently under contract with the University of Texas Press. She's also an active curator, organizing exhibitions on Latinx and diasporic arts and heritage across the US. Her latest exhibition, The Kingdom of This World, Reimagined, which features contemporary artists responding to the layered histories of the Haitian Revolution, is opening at the Pensacola Museum of Art in Florida this September. Dr. Wolff is presenting Café Culture as the Colonial Feminist Praxis, Scherezade Garcia's Blame Coffee. Lesley, the virtual floor is yours.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Gabriel and Kent, for organizing this day, which I'm really privileged to take part in. And thank you all for tuning in. And on this chilly morning, I'm like freezing in my office right now. Okay, so what I'd like to read for you today, I'm going to share my screen, is some parts from an article that I recently published related to some curatorial work that I've done with a contemporary artist. My material is, I believe, precisely 12 minutes, so I will get started. Okay. So against the backdrop of Manhattan's Garment District in the heart of New York City resides the People's Forum, a movement incubator for working class and marginalized communities. Established in 2018, the People's Forum serves as an educational and cultural center, promoting grassroots activism and providing a space for casual convenings in the cafe that occupies the forum's first floor. Hanging along the cafe wall, a large portable mural, which I'm going to refer to as Blame Coffee, and it's this mural that's up here on the left, by Scherezade Garcia, greets patrons with a grandiose scene of women imbibing both coffee and conversation. Commissioned in 2019 specifically for the Cafe and Library of the People's Forum, Garcia's painting serves to amplify the visual and historical aura of women, immigrants, and people of color within the context of a site of unfettered access and mobilization for underrepresented communities in New York. As an Afro-Latinx artist, born and raised in Santo Domingo, Dominican Republic, and a longtime resident of New York, and now actually she has just recently moved to Austin, so she's now a Texan, which is very exciting. Garcia's personal history and heritage resonates with the mural's revisionist intent and itinerant or portable medium. This paper argues that Blame Coffee utilizes the fraught histories of coffee and cafe culture as vehicles to disrupt and subvert the heteropatriarchal social order that has long dominated the public sphere. In so doing, this work gives visibility and agency to a matriarchal vision of Afro-Latinidad that remains all too often excluded from or veiled in contemporary visual arts. The mural depicts three allegorical women who not only signify the colonial history and heritage of coffee, but also collectively dominate the miniaturized figure of Napoleon Bonaparte, down here at the bottom, who languishes without regard from the women above into a liquid abyss of his own imperial excess. Many artists of color working across the Americas today utilize vernacular media as a strategy to literally and figuratively critique the legacies of racial capitalism. These works exemplify the relevance of everyday consumer practices to the development and persistence of large-scale systems of Eurocentric oppression. In this way, coffee and other comestibles have become particularly resonant objects for artists of the Caribbean, a region profoundly shaped by colonial exploits in plantation economies of crops such as indigo, tobacco, sugar, and coffee. By emphasizing the seemingly mundane but highly gendered and politicized act of conversation as a tool to bridge differences and make change manifest, Garcia privileges decolonial feminist strategies of relationality, a kind of embodied portability that evokes Garcia's own Dominican diasporic heritage, as well as the mural's portable medium. And I should note that for the sake of brevity, I've omitted my discussion here of this notion of portability, but I hope that it's perhaps something we can come back to in the Q&A. By Garcia's own account, the distinctive skin tones of each of the three women was a deliberate gesture to the global heritage and history of the coffee around which they gather. The woman at the viewer's left, a reference to coffee's Ethiopian origins. The woman at center, a mulata, and here I'm using Garcia's own terms, a mulata embodying the Afro-diasporic miscegenation wrought by colonialism in the Americas, where coffee became most rigorously tethered to racial capitalism. And at the viewer's right, a woman of Europe's intelligentsia invites the viewer into the composition with her foreshortened cup gently tilted toward the picture plane. The somber nature of this visitation is punctuated and undercut by the light blues, gold, and white that dance across the composition, suggesting opulent adornments worn by the women. This is not a clandestine meeting, but rather a public spectacle. The critique that Garcia's work leverages against Eurocentrism demonstrates the ways in which the visual arts can be harnessed as decolonial stratagem to dismantle systems of imperial domination. The work of Argentinian scholar Maria Lugones stands as an especially prominent and profound response to Aníbal Quijano's foundational concept of the, quote, colonial matrix of power. As critical race feminists have demonstrated, these structures particularly and uniquely oppress women of color, whose erasures have been doubly yoked to race and gender. Lugones realigns Quijano's critical matrix toward a pluralist axis that positions race and gender as co-constitutive forces of coloniality, or what she calls, quote, the modern colonial gender system. Lugones' framework resists the categorical outcome of thinking from a purely intersectional place. Lugones instead positions race and gender as interrelational and thus, unfixed facets of individual and collective productions of knowledge and being. Lugones, like Garcia, actively refutes linear and singular meaning in her work, instead interpreting cultures, temporalities, and geopolities through multiple lenses, a pluralistic decolonial strategy of relationality. For Garcia, relationality stems from her identification as Dominican York, a traditionally disparaging term used to describe a working-class Afro-Latinx New Yorker with Dominican roots. Blame Coffee uniquely situates its pointed critique within the heteropatriarchal Café, a site that both liberates and oppresses, collapsing private and public spheres. Historically, the Café emerged as a dynamic site of politicized discourse, a site of hyper-masculine bourgeois visibility, but exclusion of women, as well as the enslaved laborers who produced the coffee on which the lettered men imbibed, rendered coloniality a silent, if ubiquitous partner in the evolution of the so-called public sphere, entangling Café culture with the modern colonial gender system. And in the expanded paper, I kind of go into this at length about relationality and the Dominican kitchen table in relation to the European Café and public sphere. Garcia's understanding of coffee as vital to Dominican domesticity and autonomy manifests through Blame Coffee's subversion of imperial masculine power in favor of female claims to agency, resources, and visibility. Most notably, Garcia depicts Napoleon Bonaparte as a trivial, unfit leader who has succumbed to the gluttony of empire, no longer depicted in the quote-unquote grand manner of portraits by artists such as Jacques-Louis David, who we see on the right. Napoleon instead appears comically helpless, gradually submerged in a sea of coffee that was cultivated under his imperial watch. This critical passage in Garcia's mural conjures the words of Martinican writer Aimé Césaire in Discourse on Colonialism. He says, quote, "We must study how colonization works to de-civilize the colonizer, to brutalize him in the true sense of the word," end quote. In this text, Césaire provocatively reconfigures notions of agency within the colonial matrix. For Césaire, it is colonialism's paradox, its inherent vice, that it must first dehumanize the colonizer in order to dehumanize the colonized. Garcia dialogues with Césaire in her visual work through her desire to subvert conventional depictions of colonized subjects. Garcia here uses the device of splendor to complicate the relationality of subject and object. She says, quote, "It is a beauty that conquers the oppressor, and with an enticing seduction colonizes the colonizer," end quote. For Garcia, beauty becomes the vehicle for rebellion and the conduit for the dismantling of the colonial matrix of power. The beauty here resides dually in the composition styles. So there's gestural brushstrokes, jewel tone Baroque forms that are very seductive, right? And from the idea of beauty that she evokes by reference to the European art historical convention of the three graces, a representation of three virginal females that embody the classical ideas and ideals of splendor and joie de vivre. Unlike the dancing graces, however, Garcia's figures reject harmonious movement and subjugation of self. Instead, the fully clothed women occupy seated poses, restricting viewers' access to their bodies. Garcia's depiction of individualistic and resolute women at the table speaks to the idea of quote unquote machista women, and this is a phrase that Garcia uses, that the artist conjured in her mind as she created this mural. The force driving these women thus comes not from their sensuality or objectification, but rather from the subtle chaos and power that manifests from their participation in the discourse of café culture. These figures gesture to the history of female representation, but do not cater to its expectations. Larger paper, this resistance takes the form of Garcia's chosen path. Historical triangle trade onto the composition. Oh, I think I'm missing a slide there. Sorry. Who map the historical triangle trade onto the composition. And this resistance also manifests in Garcia's ties to counter-visualities about the Americas produced by female artists. These feminist artists seek to de-link from the heteropatriarchal imaginaries traditionally mapped onto the female form. So I just want to show you a few examples of these comparisons that I do in the larger article of these contemporary female artists who are using a similar kind of strategy here. This is Leah Gordon, who works off of an engraving by William Blake, showing Europe supported by Africa and the Americas. Here we have at the left a self-portrait, but also a triptych, a sort of triad by Peruvian artist Claudia Coca, whose work is after an image by German artist Albrecht Dürer. We have an altar, a kind of very well-known sort of triptych by Judy Baca at right. And then there's various triptychs produced by Maria Magdalena Campos Pons. So all of these are discussed, and we can come back to these perhaps in the Q&A. So each of these artists use the female body as a visual signifier of the conflations of place, access, and objecthood that have long characterized discourses of race and gender in the Americas. By invoking the examples above, I seek to both underscore the feminist praxis permeating Garcia's mural and to situate her work as part of a larger dialogue with and network of decolonial counter-visualities. For these artists, female relationality to one another and to the art historical canon becomes a vehicle to critique and resist the modern colonial gender system. The very act of convening together, of bringing differences to the table and bridging distinctions generates the circumstances that instigate Napoleon's demise. By refusing to cater to the silences and erasures that the modern colonial gender system has long relied upon, Blame Coffee advocates for a new kind of public sphere that acknowledges the entanglements among race, gender, and coloniality, while supplanting those modes of knowledge with the vast pluralistic universe that Latinx artists such as Garcia have learned to traverse. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Wolff, for this presentation. And now we are going to introduce, or let me introduce you to Manuel García. He's an international student from Guatemala who is pursuing a PhD in agricultural and applied economics. His research interests are consumer demand, agribusiness, data analysis, and agricultural value chains. He has previous experience in the private agribusiness sector and international agricultural organizations in Latin America. He presents the collaborative research project, an overview of the impact of COVID-19 on the Latin American agricultural supply chain, perspectives from producers and experts. Manuel, the virtual floor is yours.
Thank you. Well, thank you for this opportunity to stay here with you. And well, I have that. I'm glad to stay here and to share this the main finding that for this collaborative research with different universities in the US and Latin America. So the title is an overview of the impact of the COVID-19 on the Latin American agriculture supply chain from the perspective from producers and experts. I'm going to start saying that we know that the COVID has been impacted the economy in different levels in different countries. And according to the International Monetary Fund for the last year, where the Latin America economy shrank by 9.4%. And many of countries in Latin America, in this region, where agriculture is considered as essential as healthcare, energy, water services. So we can imagine that the disruption in these agri-food systems could put at risk the food security of many people and the economies and the social welfare of many countries in the region. So the agri-food system has a complexity level, and it make it very vulnerable to some changes for implementation of health measures for the governments, regulation in the industries, and all of these changes generated due to the pandemic. We found that some studies have been emphasized on the impact and the economic impact on different subpopulations in the region, but none of them talk about directly impacting the agricultural sector, which is where we are focusing our objectives, which is assess the impact of the pandemic specifically in the agricultural supply chain in the Latin American region. So this is the data for the data collection, where we use a digital survey using the software Qualtrics, in which we use a different channel to distribute it. The main were email, social networks as WhatsApp and Facebook to gather all this information. The survey was designed and implemented during the peak of the pandemic in all of these countries. And we collect like 1,500 responses, but after cleaning the data, we end up with 1,478 responded, which is a good data for. Mainly the data came from 23 countries, and most of them are from South America and Central America, and very few from the Caribbean. The survey was designed to address two different groups of respondents. The first one, the main respondents, which include the farmers, the processor, the people who is in fact doing the activity day by day. And the second group is the agricultural supply chain supported, which is composed by government, exchange agents, academics, finance sectors, consultants, all of these guys. During the data collection, where we try to avoid minors, to collect information from minors and people who is not directly or indirectly related with the agriculture supply chain. And the survey was divided in 4 sections. The first section is to address the socio-demographic characteristics of respondents. The second was measure the impact of the pandemic on the performance. And the third, to see what were the responses to the crisis. And the fourth, to see what is the future perspective they have after the pandemic. For the data analysis, where we use a software, a statistical software, SAS, to get some summary statistic and run some regression analysis models to explore the heterogeneity of the impacts. This is one of the descriptive summary statistics. as we see here, the average in age in our respondents is like 38 years from the main actors and a little bit older for the change supporter, 44 years. Around 30% of the respondents were female, which is 1/3 of the population in the ag supply chain. So the main observation came from the urban areas. And we see here that more than 80% of respondents has at least a professional degree, bachelor or higher degrees. Something interesting here was that most of the data, 60% or more, is involved directly in agriculture production. They are producers, and very few of them are distributed in the process and all along the supply chain. Most of the data came from a small business. So we can see here that with their annual sales revenue values were less than $50,000 per year. And the company size were less than 50 employees. So most of these resources apply for those small scale business, agribusiness. One of the main findings was the impact on the performance and the agri-food supply chain. So we see here that the main change, even both main actors and change supporters, they agree that the main impact was in the change in the total revenue. So both of them had the same opinion, like in the reduction of the total revenue around 23%. For the responses to the crisis, we see here that most of the companies apply sanitary security measures. We see that more than 90% of companies. Also, they make effort to increase its revenue during this time. Like 70%, we see that 70% of the main actors and change supporters agree that these companies apply different strategies to increase its revenues. And also we see here that almost 30% of those companies explore different business or different activities during this time. We see here that the use of technology is increased more than 15%, 20% for the main actors and the change supporters during the pandemic. So this time of crisis make people innovate in different activities, because if they want to survive in these times, this rough time, so they implement some innovation, some basic innovation sometimes. For example, the delivery to the consumer, we see here that it's the main innovation. All those people participate. Diversification of products. So they want to reduce the risk in one specific product. So that's why they diversificate, and that was the second main innovation. The third one was the use of technology for different activities, from purchases on sales. So the use of internet, apps, and other things, technology tools were very useful in this time. So they add value to the product, for example, improve the packaging, the processing, and the sale of credit was the last main innovation for those participants. When we see the future perspectives in the next 2 years, we see here two main perspectives. The one is the adaptation process is expected. All of them agreed that an adaptation process is expected to, and it's happening right now, and it's going to continue after the pandemic. And they are very optimistic in the increase in production and services. They expected to recover and increase its services. We have the expert opinion and how they plan to continue supporting actors in this agri-food system. So we see here that 85% of those experts, they want to make a change in combination face-to-face and digital support to those farmers. And only 10% of them plan to migrate totally to the digital channels, which is a huge change in the traditional way of assistance to the farmers, producers, and all these actors. As the last part, we have the OLS result, which is the regression analysis results. As we see here, the main impact we have is that the change supporters have a higher opinion perspective about the change in prices and total cost with respect to the main actors. And we think this kind of higher perspective can be that during the time we run the survey was the peak of the pandemic. So during this time, most of these change supporters, they have a lack of connection because they were adapting to different these digital sources and channels. So probably it makes that they have a higher perspective of what's going on in the field during this time. But even though they were very accurate with most of the responses, as we see here, the agri-food suppliers, they claim to be one of the most affected in terms of increasing the price in the markets and also increases in the total revenue. And the sector of logistics and distribution, where they were affected most by the price increases in price and the total cost. And as a conclusion, where we have the pandemic hit the agri-food supply chain is increasing the total cost and decreasing the total revenue. And almost 75% of the companies or farmers made some effort to increase its revenues. And my final conclusion will be that this event accelerated the technology change in the entire agricultural supply chain, and it will represent a good opportunity for development, but it must be carefully analyzed by our entities in charge to ensure the success. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Manuel, for your presentation. And finally, lastly, but not least, it's for me a pleasure to introduce you Dr. Jobi Martinez. She's a graduate of the College of Media and Communication at Texas Tech. During her time as a student in the PhD program, Jobi examined how communication is utilized to advance diversity, equity, access, and inclusion. Today, Jobi serves as the Executive Director of the Racial Justice Institute and the Center for Anti-Racism. She also serves as a lead consultant for the National Diversity Council and EPIC Collaborative Advisors. Her primary consulting focus is anti-racism and strategic communication. Before her current role, Jobi worked at the University of Houston, downtown Outtech, and Texas Tech University. And if you follow her on her social media, you will know all about Tiger and Harvey, her two precious cats. She is presenting the study, HSIs, Hispanic non-performative serving institutions. Jobi, the virtual floor is yours.
Let me jump in real quickly before Jobi speaks and mention that Jobi was sort of the co-founder of this whole enterprise. We basically conceptualized this symposium together when we were working together at the Harris Institute. So I think that's an important part of her bio as well. And it's good to see you, Jobi.
Thank you. It's good to see everyone as well. I apologize for a little bit of my tardiness. If you know me well, you know I always tend to double book myself. So I'm coming in from another conference. And there was a part of me that, because I pre-recorded the session last night for this conference or the symposium, there's a part of me that thought, oh man, I really hope they play that recording because I think that's going to be a little bit more comprehensive than me jumping in now, but I'll go ahead and start the presentation. Thank you. It's so great to see all of you and to be back for the 6th annual. As I started thinking about that, I was like, wow, 6 years, how wonderful and exciting to be a part of this again. So thank you for those kind words, Dr. Wilkinson. I'm trying to see if I have share screen capabilities so I can share my presentation.
Yes.
All right, there we go. So again, thank you all for your time this morning as I kind of get the presentation going. And of course, things moving a little slow this morning. All right, so here we are. So again, thank you, and I'm excited to participate in the 6th annual Texas Tech Hispanic Latinx Research and Creative Symposium with the Thomas J. Harris Institute for Hispanic and International Communication. So glad to be a part of this again. As I mentioned, we do have the recording. So if I don't cover everything this morning that I was thinking about last night at about midnight when I recorded that, then you can have access to that. And again, if you have any questions. So I do apologize having to rush in from another, luckily the blessings of Zoom, right? I was able to rush in from another session. So this morning I want to talk a little bit about HSIs. So again, as Dr. Wilkinson mentioned, you know, being with IHIC for 6 years and being a part of this for 6 years, I've really had an interest in HSIs. And some of that interest also stems from my early work. When I was recruited to serve as a recruiter for Texas Tech University, I was tasked with the initiative of increasing enrollment of Hispanic students at Texas Tech, and that was back in 2002. So I think that's kind of stayed in sort of the residual space where I've always thought about our approaches to HSIs, and then specifically really to sort of narrow that down when I started my PhD studies there with the College of Media and Communication, looking at the communication aspect of all of that. So that's kind of what we're going to be talking about a little bit this morning. So I thought that was a really great logo. In 2020, we celebrated 25 years of this concept, right? This concept of what an HSI is. And we're going to briefly spend a little time on that, but not too much, because I know that, again, being mindful of the symposium and the schedule and time for Q&A. So what is an HSI? So most people pretty much understand it as the basic qualifiers being that you need 25% or more to serve of students that identify as Hispanic to qualify, apply for, and achieve that status, that designation, that identity of being a Hispanic serving institution. But there are also other statuses of emerging HSIs, established HSIs. There are different sort of levels of HSIs that sometimes we don't consider. And again, that is something that I found in my research when I took on this research project. So what I'm going to be talking a little bit about this morning is a research project I did in 2018, and then how I've sort of reconceptualized that under anti-racism, which is a lot of the work that I've been doing lately. And then again, presenting some of the findings around both of those analyses and talking about performative and non-performative HSIs. And again, there was a part of me that wishes we would have played the video because I feel like I was more in tune with this information last night at midnight. So in 2018, I was a TACHE Fellow, Texas Association of Chicanos in Higher Education. And thank you to Dr. Wilkinson also for supporting my application in that. So I was awarded a TACHE Fellowship, Graduate Fellowship. As part of that fellowship, I had to conduct research that supported that fellowship. And if you're not familiar with TACHE, the Texas Association of Chicanos in Higher Education, they have a strong focus on Hispanic serving institutions. So that year that I presented at the conference, which was 2018, almost every conference session was on Hispanic serving institutions. But in 2018, I talked about the framing and reframing of HSIs. So I decided to do a study again for this fellowship, and I looked at 5 institutions in the state of Texas. So 5 higher education institutions. 4 were public, 1 was private. So we had 1 community college and then 1 community college and 4 universities that were a part of this study. So what was a part of this study? I know you're reading through this, but I want to give you a little bit more context. So the institutions were selected basically based on geography. I wanted to see if there were different approaches to HSI status, HSI resources, HSI activities, based on the region of the state that they were located in. So I tried to be strategic in picking institutions where maybe they were a border institution, maybe they were an institution in West Texas, East Texas, Hill Country, et cetera. I wanted to be strategic of who I selected for this study. So in that work, I was directed to individuals who were either at the lead of HSI work or at the lead of the HSI application to talk to. So it was partly interviews, but the other part of it was just looking at their communication. So anything from websites, social media, I talked to the person that I interviewed, and if they would give me brochures or even event flyer information, that was considered in the study. And then again, sort of a review of the interviews, which is again, in that analysis, I was looking to see how it was framed, how HSIs were being framed, how they were being talked about, how the products, services, or outcomes or results of being an HSI were being communicated. And I was really strategic at looking at emerging and at looking at established. So established means they've already had the official federal designation of being an HSI. Emerging being they were between that 21% to 24.9%, I believe it is, that they are making the argument for the application. So that's the emerging HSI. So what I found was within sort of looking at these institutions in totality, right, all of these 5 institutions, is that there was kind of an instant divide in the communication strategies. One was lack of communication, one was a heavy emphasis of communication. So lack of communication on being an emerging HSI, or lack of communication on being an established HSI, or the other side of that, heavy communication emphasis on an emerging HSI and heavy communication emphasis on being an established HSI, right? So what I found in the emerging HSI frames though, the frames that were being utilized was a booming HSI. So I use that term to describe these emerging Hispanic serving institutions in the state of Texas that celebrated becoming an HSI, that they were almost to that 25%, or that they were almost at that application status. So they were booming, right? So they communicated resources, they communicated conferences, they communicated activities, they communicated, constantly communicating sort of the demographics and where they were in terms of percentages, in terms of population. They highlighted things like their students. There were student profiles, there were faculty profiles, there were staff profiles, even community profiles, right? Because we know community engagement is a big part of family engagement. Community engagement is a big part of Hispanic culture and being an HSI, Hispanic serving. It's the serving in the HSI, right? And then there were the silent HSIs. And this is what I found particularly interesting. In a way they were silent, but in a way they were silenced. So in some of these interviews, I found that the silent HSIs were being asked to be silent by the administrative leadership. So they didn't want it, aside from like the planning team and the task team, they really didn't want to communicate to other internal stakeholders or external stakeholders that they were on the cusp, or that they were planning to apply for HSI status, or they were about to hit that 25%. They really didn't want that communicated out or even internally. They just tasked a few individuals with it, maybe the admissions committee, maybe the diversity office, or maybe just certain faculty and staff to help with the sort of achieve that 25%, or to participate in those activities that would get them to that 25% where they could achieve application status. So this is established. I thought I was going to get onto the reasoning with my slide. I apologize. So let's talk about the established HSIs. Those were the emerging HSIs. So what I found with the established HSIs, now again, these are the HSIs that have already received this designation, that have already applied, received this federal designation. Some had received funding, some were still waiting for funding, but they were established HSI. They could pronounce to the world that they were an established HSI. What I found was there was very few, and again, there were only 5, but that the established HSIs who were once booming HSIs, maybe in their emerging phase once upon a time, when they got to that established HSIs, they really didn't communicate that they were an HSI. They didn't put forward marketing materials. They didn't put on the events that they had before or during that emerging phase. So I'll be a little bit more clear. There was one institution that I did follow because this was a year study, not follow, but we talked about sort of that process of becoming an emerging to an established HSI. So we did have, in my interviews, I did talk to the established HSIs of, tell me a little bit more about your emerging process. So that was included in the study. So what I found was for those that were emerging, that did quite a bit of work in their emerging phase, once they received the were at the established HSI phase, there was very little communication around that. Or even the established HSIs that I interviewed that maybe didn't have quite the emerging phase. I know that gets a little confusing and I'll try to clarify that in a minute. So let me just go ahead and start with just talking about the established HSIs, and then I'll come back to talking about the processes. So the frames that I identified was hidden and subdued. There really weren't established HSIs that promoted their HSI status. In other words, you found it at the entrance of their website. You found it persistently in their social media. You found it even during Hispanic Heritage Months or sort of those types of celebrations. That was not identified. So the established HSIs were kind of categorized into frames of hidden or subdued. Hidden meaning it took you a while to find out that they were an HSI if you're going through their communication, any piece of communication, social media, websites, looking at events. There was a lot of conversation on, again, we are an HSI, but we don't really communicate that we're an HSI. And then there were others that were a bit more subdued. They talked about being an HSI only in certain circumstances, right? If it was a specific recruitment event, if it was a specific university event, or if it was a specific task or committee, they only really sort of talked about being an HSI then. You found it in some material, but not a lot of material. So it was maybe a bit more subdued. Now I'm going to come back to that conversation I was just trying to have of those established HSIs that talked about their communication while an emerging HSI. So there was, again, the ones that I mentioned that were kind of the booming. We talked loudly, we talked proudly, we were so excited to becoming an HSI, but once we achieved HSI status, we kind of quieted down a little bit. And then again, the others being, we really didn't do much to communicate we were going to become an HSI, and we kind of maintained that status once we became an HSI. So I'll talk a little bit about reframing as well. For those that were established HSIs, specifically looking at those that talked about being an emerging and then going to established, they reframed their HSI initiatives as either first generation, Pell eligible, or if there were conversations of HSI status, they mostly changed that conversation or reframed that conversation into saying the changing demographics of the state are asking us to do X, Y, Z, right? Or that's why we've become an HSI, because of the changing demographics of our state. So it was kind of reframed in the sense that we're an HSI, but we just became an HSI, right? There was no special tactic or special events. It just, the state changed, education has changed, the demographics in both of those has changed, thus impacting our institution. Thus we qualified for HSI status, HSI application. And again, this is quite a bit of sort of a lot of information to throw in terms of framing and reframing. But the common finding was that yes, there was some communication, especially around the emerging phase, but once there was an established phase, there was either less or little communication about celebrating or being an HSI. And in the interviews, I found that these were the primary reasons. Political, and I don't mean just sort of like, you know, our governor, or I say Texas, but our governor, government, or political administration. What I mean is sort of the political pressure from constituents, from those internal or external stakeholders, anywhere from donors, alumni, parents of students, even faculty and staff or other students. There was that pressure of, or that pushback of, especially during the emerging HSI phase of, wait a second, and it really had to do a lot around inclusion and exclusion. So there were concerns that becoming an HSI or being an established HSI would only focus on Hispanic students, and that others would be excluded from programs, resources, services, or even the attention of education, right? Educational access, educational opportunities, that certain communities would be excluded because this institution was solely going to focus on Hispanic students through that HSI designation or that identity. So these were some of the reasons as to why there was little communication, or there, especially around the established HSI phase, as to why they decided not to really communicate, or as we would call it, celebrate HSI status or promote HSI status because of these reasons. The other part of it was because there really was a lack of understanding. So if we were branding ourselves as an HSI, well, that also puts us at the forefront of serving. And we know through research has told us that there's often conflict. And I say conflict because there's a lack of understanding of how to advance the serving and servingness in Hispanic serving. Is that advocacy? Is that mentorship? Is that teaching? Is that pipeline? Is that So there are different approaches to the serving and thus a lack of understanding. And so many institutions, or through the individuals that I interviewed, they felt that their institution just didn't quite know how to carry out the HSI, not just the designation, but the servingness in the HSI. And so therefore were shy to promote that they were an HSI institution. And then for many, they just kind of subsumed these initiatives or activities under their DEI functions and kind of left it to DEI, either offices or individuals, to be the ones to lead or promote or to advance HSI activities. And so again, these were some of the reasons as to why there was limited communication, especially at the established HSI status. So again, for the sake of time, I'm gonna just kind of talk a little bit about how I took this study under this new lens that I'm working on. And I also thankful to Dr. Wilkinson because during my time as his student, and bless him for being my chair, I was contacted by another institution to help with their anti-racism initiatives. And at that point, I was like, I don't even know what anti-racism is. But through my studies and my dissertation, surprisingly, yes, I am using my dissertation quite a bit these days. I hope that that is welcome to those of you who are in the dissertation process or who have chaired the dissertation. But I live and breathe my dissertation these days.
Jobi, sorry to interrupt you, but we are over time. So yeah, if you wrap up, so we can go to we can have a time for Q&A, please.
Absolutely, and I know I came in a little late, so I apologize for that. And this is recorded, so you can get the last part of this via recording if you would like. So what I did was take a look at non-performative anti-racism and performative anti-racism. And through that lens, I took this data again, and it was very similar findings in terms of those emerging non-performatives. So I want to come back to this. Non-performative is communication acts with no action. So in other words, we're an HSI, but there's little work around that. Performative anti-racism is we're an HSI and these are the things that we do, but we're not really advancing the serving and the servingness. These are my findings. And for the sake of time, and again, because we have that wonderful recording, I don't mind if we distribute the recording, which is probably a little bit more organized than today's presentation. I apologize for coming in, but the findings were pretty much the same under this anti-racism analysis, that because of political, social, and this notion of inclusion or exclusion, that is what leads to non-performative and performative HSI strategies and tactics by established Hispanic serving institutions in the state of Texas. So that's my end. If you'd have questions, or again, we have our Q&A session now, you're welcome to contact me here. Thank you, Gabriel.
Thank you so much, Jobi, and thank you so much for all the all the presenters for being here and for having this excellent discussion and conversation of the wide array of topics about Hispanic and Latinx communities. So this is, I think that we have 6 minutes more or less to have this conversation, this chance to ask questions and having comments about the topics that we have heard. So please feel free to raise your virtual hand if you want to ask a question, or if you want to type it in on the chat, I will be pleased to read them.
While people are thinking of questions, just a reminder that our keynote address beginning at 12:30 is going to focus on issues that are closely related to what Dr. Martinez was just mentioning in terms of best practices of HSIs, and we're hoping that will help launch a discussion into where Texas Tech is and sort of what we need to be doing and thinking about. So we'd love to have you join us if you're available, then Dr. Martinez, but just so you know, that's coming. We have one session in between, but at 12:30, if you'd like to continue that conversation, certainly we'd like to hear your input and your feedback.
Okay, Dr. Wolff, please, if you may ask your question.
Yeah, sure. I just wanted to ask a question of Jesus, and thank you to all of the my fellow panelists. And I mean, I think there's a lot of different conversations happening that all kind of converge in interesting ways. So I wish that we had more time. But there was something that You mentioned, Jesus, at the start of your presentation that kind of piqued my interest, and I was wondering if you could speak a little more about it, because I'm less familiar with the geopolitical, circumstances, as it were, like physically on the ground at the border. I'm more, familiar with the Caribbean borders, as it were. And so I'm wondering about this idea of the naturalization of these modes of policing at the border. And if you could speak a little more to the ways in which that happens, how in your research and from your bio, it sounds like you were a resident there. So in your personal experience, how is that operating in your estimation, that these ideas of the naturalization of this is just the way that the border, this policing is simply the natural order, right? What are some ways in which that really manifests, maybe in the 90s versus now, or just in the 90s? I'm just sort of curious to hear a little more about how that works.
Sure, thank you for your question. Well, speaking as a fronterizo myself, it's pretty common. For us to see Border Patrol rolling around the streets it's normal. It's just as seeing the police rolling around. We really don't question it. We really don't mind it either. We cross the border daily. I do it still whenever I go home. Like I always like to say, if we're saying, oh, I'm going to Juarez, I'm going to El Paso, it's the equal of saying I'm going to Walmart, I'm going to Target. Doesn't really mean much to us. To someone else, is like, oh wow, you're going to a different country. Yeah, but just like, who cares? You're just crossing. It's definitely very covert and very overt at the same time. So one of the tactics that is pretty much used since the Obama administration is something called the metering system, which essentially is like a pre-checkpoint, if you will, where Border Patrol sends between like 1 to 2 agents, and they stand exactly at the division of the border bridge on the US side. And the whole purpose is that they just sit there or stand and they're just chatting. And at any point, they can ask for your visa, your passport. And it's at random. It could be someone like me or anybody. They can just stop you if they so want to. So for us, at times, it's kind of like we police ourselves, because as you're going up the bridge, to meet them, your expectations that they're going to be there, and you automatically start drawing up your passport or your visa to have it handy. Or sometimes they're just chatting and you just flag it, and they'll acknowledge it. Sometimes they don't, and you just go on. But it's essentially done more specifically now with the asylee and refugee migrants who are trying to turn themselves into Border Patrol, especially at the port of entry, before we basically dismantle the asylum law. They could just do that, and we have to grant them asylum. But by putting this method of enforcement, we basically turn them back without having to acknowledge their request at the border. So it's pretty open, but at the same time, it's also pretty discreet.
And can you, sorry, just to jump in and follow, because I find this, really interesting. And for me, being like newly, embedded in Texas, it's something that I'm eager to have more conversations about. But like, what about the media landscape and these kind of, as an art historian, I'm thinking about the images and the media. What are some ways in which, beyond the actual checkpoints, this is naturalized and reinforced? I'm just sort of curious. I know we're basically at time, but
there's a good piece of literature that I would recommend for you to read. It's called the Latino Thread by Chavez. I forget his first name. I'm sorry. I'm going to try to speed it up because I know we're running out of time. But his whole book covers about probably 30 to 40 years of depiction of migrants through the media, especially from the 1980s all the way to his present day. I think he published it in 2003 and then made a second edition in 2004. But it's essentially a way of kind of what we were talking with the previous presentation of reframing the border, right? That it's a very outlaw type of place that you can't find control. Therefore, it justifies people like Chief Reyes to propose his border wall and not having to worry about him enforcing it or pushing it down. All he had to do was to wait for something bad to happen and just bank on that idea and say, there's my excuse. They robbed the train, they're attacking us. We need to build it, right? And of course, the nativist hysteria that this country sadly suffers a lot from just banks on that and uses it to enforce the border. So it's a very dialectic representation, very welcoming too. I mean, you see posters from the Bracero era welcoming migrants, but at the same time, 10 years later, posters of the same propaganda wanting to kick them out. So it goes both ways.